Another film director I collected many years ago and tried to watch all of their movies was the acclaimed director Akira Kurosawa. He's a Japanese filmmaker who made lots of movies between the sort of late 50s and mid 80s, and again, like most of these well-renowned directors that have a lot of fandom in the cine world, yeah, he makes a lot of good movies and a lot of very good watchable movies. Some of his works are considered all-time greats, and rightly so. But when you delve into their works and look at everything, you sort of see where they go a bit wayward sometimes. The films where Akira Kurosawa goes a bit wayward, he sort of finds himself in his own little rabbit hole that is probably more personal to him than the audience, and he tends to lose the audience a bit. In his case, he seemed to get into poverty porn, what I call poverty porn. And this is quite a common thing in art, and particularly in the film industry, is that people who are concerned about the human condition and consider the human condition to be something they like to make films about, it's very easy to get sucked into poverty porn, trying to use film to discuss and examine why people are poor and the causes that might result in them being poor. And it's sort of very alluring, really, because when you get down to the kind of poverty levels that Akira Kurosawa was going to, you're verging on the stage where the people in the poverty are probably there because they've got some kind of mental illness. You know, not just a casual mental illness, but some kind of serious mental illness. And the problem with trying to empathise with mental illness is that in order to try and think how that person is thinking, by default, you know, ergo, you have to try and think like a mad person. And by doing so, you probably drive yourself a bit mad. It's all a bit One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you know what I mean? And as a result, those are probably his weakest films, the most difficult to get into, the ones where he struggles to actually find a point and kind of just ends up a bit like a lot of YouTube vlogs, in that they just end up a bit of a ramble, not necessarily any coherent conclusion. A bit of a, this is the state of it, isn't it a pity? Isn't it a shame? Or if not that, just here's some poor people who want to watch them. But this doesn't only affect film directors. This is something rich people can get themselves sucked into as well. Or not necessarily rich people, but just people who aren't very worldly wise, in that poverty often gets associated with exciting things like prostitution and drugs, and an altogether more hard, cynical world. And lonely men with a lot of money might think, oh, now I can go and afford to take advantage of the poor section of town. All that available sex and drugs, how exciting that will be. Not realising the extent of cynicism and madness that exists in extreme poverty, and that no, they're not going to find cheap true love in the world of poverty. They're just going to find people with such a completely different mindset that compatibility is exceedingly unlikely, and they are more likely to contract some kind of weird disease that somebody's not bothered to have checked up than they are to find any kind of genuine romantic affection. And that the world of drugs isn't necessarily one of excitement and partying, in that the world of poverty drug taking is more about escaping from reality, and that the drugs you might encounter are probably more likely to be cut with nasty substances that might have serious health impacts. And it's not just men that can fall into these traps, of course, it can be the ladies as well, because ladies always have this fascination that there's this what they consider to be an attractive bloke who's probably just fallen by the wayside, and if they just had a good woman they could turn them into a good man. And that kind of mothering appeal is quite overwhelming for some women, and they can never look past the fact that that person that they're infatuated with has come from a poor side of town and is probably irrevocably broken in some capacity. And in both cases, very often the case will be that any kind of genuine romance that appears to emerge in the long term just shows to be a primarily parasitic relationship where the person of the culture of poverty is merely using their host as a means to get their latest paycheck. And of course, by poverty, I'm not meaning just numbers. You know, I'm talking about the entire communities that are culturally poor. And it sounds like I'm being a bit mean to poor people now, you see, because it sounds like I'm dissing the poor, when that's not the case. In both those scenarios I just mentioned, or in all the scenarios I've mentioned, it's always when people who are not part of that community go into that community expecting something that doesn't exist. They haven't been a part of that culture since they were born, so they have no ability to conceptualise the kind of people that they're encountering, and they're kind of going into that situation in that sort of David Attenborough way, as if this poor community was in some way something to be investigated, and it's a different world, as it were. They are the interlopers, and the people in the culture of poverty, they exist in their world. It's not to them their world is not a negative, their world is their world, and they survive in their world by having lived the experience of their cultural environment, and they're doing what they can to survive in their own way. But when the outsider comes in with these alternate expectations, they are suddenly these specimens to be examined. And it's not them asking for help, as it were. It's somebody coming in and in their mind offering help, but all they're doing is confusing the situation and possibly making the lives of the poor people more complicated by inserting themselves as this unusual element that isn't normally there. I suppose the equivalent of somebody going to a foreign country and then expecting everybody in that country to be like their country they've come from. And poverty porn can come from any angle. It can come from do-gooders, or it can come from hostile elements, or it can just come from Attenborough-like observances, or however you like it. This strange fascination that people have with the extreme poverty. It's sort of unendingly alluring. Since time immemorial, people have tried to do something about it, or they've tried to imagine that they can manipulate it to their benefit, or they've tried to imagine that they can eradicate it in a negative sense. And the poor community often finds itself the butt of lots of negative approaches to societal organisation. But it doesn't ever go away, it doesn't ever change. It's always the same, because it's always the same kind of people that eventually find their way into that scenario, be it from a medical, mental condition, or a psychology that has led them to imbibe intoxicants at their leisure, or a complete inability to function in the very basic aspects of intelligence. If only there was a solution, if only there was a reason, if only there was some logic about it. But if you clear it away, it just slowly emerges again in some other location, because it's a natural human trait for the percentage of us to eventually find our way down that path. Or if you try and help them all, if you rush in there and give them all $1 million and say, go ahead, go away and make a life for yourself, and gradually they all lose their $1 million in one way or another and gradually filter back to the same place. And the more you try and understand it by going there and living within the community, or trying to take advantage of the community, the more you'll just be entangled in this unworldly maelstrom of unfathomable logic that will probably drive you mad before you come to any kind of logical understanding. And this is why I always try and shy away from this particular genre of film. It's quite a consistent genre of film over the generations, and you can see elements of it in all kinds of films from all of the decades, you know, right from Charlie Chaplin to Ken Loach and beyond. And it's always these kinds of films that they're always get referred to possibly as Oscar bait, because there seems to be something indelibly intellectual about doing studies on poverty and projecting yourself as somebody who primarily cares about poverty and the poverty in society. But it's so easy to forget that poverty is different to extreme poverty. Financial poverty isn't the issue. People in financial poverty are a different situation to people in cultural poverty. And even with the best will in the world, if you try and make a film about cultural poverty, essentially what you're doing is a form of exploitation. It's its own kind of genre of exploitation, hence why I refer to it as poverty porn. But I suppose for some people that's escapism. If you have led a life of no worries and I suppose what you might call average secure middle class or average secure upper class, then cultural poverty is like fantasy. That is your version of escaping from your world into somebody else's completely different world. But the problem I have with the genre is that they try and say it's more serious because it's dealing with a more serious issue. You know, an overlooked issue, and it's not an overlooked issue. It's an overdone issue. It's not overlooked, it's overdone. It's just poverty porn.